Good morning for our US attendees and good evening for our European attendees. My name is Melissa Savage and I'm with AASHTO. Welcome to today's webinar where we'll be looking at climate resilience approaches in use in Europe and the United States. Before we get started, I just want to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. All of the attendees are on listen-only mode, but you can pose questions at any time using the chat feature on the control panel that you see on the right side of your screen. We will do facilitated questions following the presentations. So please enter your questions at any time throughout the presentations and we'll have plenty of time for those at the end. So without delay, I would like to hand it over to Kees with the Ministry of Infrastructure in the Netherlands. 1 second, Kees.
Yes, good morning. I have to say to you, for me, it's the end of the afternoon. And together with my colleague, Mitra Leistra, we will present on our stress tests of our highway network. And Mitra will actually dig into how we actually validate the results in our regional partial Rijkswaterstaat, which is the executive part of the Ministry of Infrastructure. So, start the presentation. So you see some images of our infrastructure, but also our cities and highways along industrial areas. So it's a low-lying country with a lot of water, but yeah, it's at the moment it's quite dry actually. And
sorry to interrupt,
yes.
but apparently we're having some audio issues with it cutting in and out, and we may need to turn off the videos to try and address the audio problem. So let's try.
My video?
What's that?
Shall I shut off my video?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So after the introduction, I will tell about our highway stress test shortly, and Mitra will talk after me about the regional validation in this course. So rainfall did get quite a lot of attention the last 10 years. We had lots of, especially in the beginning of the summer, lots of showers, and it caused some problems with our road infrastructure, as you can see. And actually, the picture in the middle below, at night, we had a large flood just last week, the flooding of the highway causing some also some traffic jams. So people are getting more and more aware of the effects of extreme weather. But also, at the moment, we're in our third dry year in a row, as you can see, which causes low levels in the rivers, but also cause problems with some roadside fires. And on the long term, it may cause more soil subsidence. And during heat, we did have some problems with bridges not closing because of extreme high temperatures for the Netherlands at least. We are aware that climate change is not a problem on its own. We need to look at it. When we look at the effects, also acknowledge that there are other things like COVID that have an effect on infrastructure and mobility. And just today I heard the trains are not so busy because of COVID and they have to cut costs there. So these are effects we didn't actually expect and will may cause more traffic on the road, which we hadn't expected just a couple of months ago. And when we look at the effects on our road infrastructure, we also need to look at what is the relationship with travel and transport on other networks. So that's the things that we're looking at. So this diagram shows the process we are in at the moment at Rijkswaterstaat. And what we do is actually follows from climate change policy in the Netherlands. And so due to that, we performed our stress test. So we look at the vulnerability of our roads, climate change. Following this, at the moment, we're in the process of actually validating the results. And Mitra will tell you some more about that. And eventually, all this process will lead to an implementation agenda where we look to measures, actually implement measures. And as I said, we finished our road stress test last year. And following that, at the moment, we are busy also doing stresses for the waterways, which are also managed by Rijkswaterstaat, and the water systems, which, for example, include locks, but also dikes along the rivers and the dunes along the sea, for example. So our stress test of the road, we looked at the following hazards or threats: extreme rainfall, which causes water on the roads, but also safety issues during heavy precipitation can cause instability of embankments, but also because due to rising groundwater levels might lift up tunnels or light materials under the roads. Also, we looked at the fluvial and coastal flooding. I'll show you a picture of that later on. Heat, which can cause expansion and damage to pavements. And I already showed you a picture of a bridge that got stuck. We need to take measures, or either changing the design or management measures like cooling the bridge during heat waves. And lastly, droughts, which long term may lead to more soil subsidence and then unequal settlement of the roads, but also risk of roadside fires. These results, we have them online at the moment, and actually at the moment in the process of making them more interactively accessible. So it's more easy to use for all the stakeholders. So we have on the left, you see a picture of the fluvial and coastal flooding. It's a worst case map. So 60% of our country is below water level. And in the worst case, this map shows which parts of the country will be flooded. And because of that, also a large part of our road network is susceptible for flooding. The thing is, though, we have a very high level protection against high water, so the actual possibility of this happening is not very large. So the risk is actually not that high. But water on the road due to extreme rainfall does happen quite often. So we have these effects much more than that. And, yes. And next, some pictures of where are the bridges that are vulnerable to heat, for example. Where are the roadsides which are vulnerable to fire? For example, on sandy areas and woody areas, there's more risk than in more urban and open areas with clay, for example. And on the right, you can see a map where soil subsidence, the roads that are vulnerable to subsidence due to soil subsidence are also shown. You can see. So all these results are, at the moment, we are, as I told you, are validated. So we're in the process of having risk dialogues with stakeholders, both within our organization, but also external stakeholders like provinces and water boards that manage all the areas around our networks, because we want to take measures together and not on our own. So because that is good for acceptance of measures, but also maybe more effective. And also within our organization at the moment, we use our stress results to actually see how can we use the results in performance management and also maintenance plans, for example. And climate change is also taken into account in our replacement and renovation program. And so in the end, all this process will lead to adaptation strategies. And that's also, we also need to negotiate that with our ministry, who actually, as I would say, pays us to actually build and maintain and manage our roads. So now this is very short introduction to our stress test, and now I'll hand it over to Mirte.
Yes, thanks, Kees. So Kees will be clicking for me to the next sheets, and I'll tell you some more on the next steps that Kees already mentioned. So Rijkswaterstaat has been set up from different units. And as the knowledge unit, we are responsible for the stress testing. However, it are the regional units from Rijkswaterstaat that are responsible to actually implement measures in time. So that is the next part that we're dealing with their stress test. So if we go to the next slide, it may be similar to what Kees already told, but the next steps that we are going to take is, first of all, validate the stress test with our asset managers. The asset managers, they have the best knowledge on how our infrastructure is maintained and what it means for measures that can be taken. And the next step is to start this internal risk dialogue. And the main thing about this risk dialogue is to assess which risks are acceptable and which aren't. So what we have to do is basically make this risk assessment. So it's the next step beyond the stress test. And we'll show you how that works. And this risk dialogue can lead indeed to maintenance or new projects or adjustment to building standards. So if you go to the next sheet, you see the first result for the stress test for heat and the risk of bridges. So bridges are susceptible to failing due to heat. But if we look at our stress test, we say that in essence, every bridge is vulnerable. So then how do we prioritize? That's the next step. So we go to the next sheet. So indeed, in essence, every bridge is vulnerable to malfunction. And then the next sheet will explain how we do that. So we look at the place in which we look at two things. We look at costs, first of all. So we look at repair costs. These are costs that we as Rijkswaterstaat have to cover. But we also look at traffic jams. These are societal costs and may be heavier scored than usual repair costs. We used a module developed by Deltares, our research institute that did our stress test, to see what bridges are then most vulnerable. And if we go to the next sheet, you see that for a regional unit of Rijkswaterstaat, several bridges, and if we click again, you can see some circles arriving, that some bridges are more critical than others. And that indeed has to do, for example, with redundancy in the network. If you look at the bridge in the right corner, it's red because there is basically no redundancy in our highway system. So if this bridge fails, it has a major impact on the functioning of our entire infrastructure system. So these bridges could be prioritized first. Or we look at which bridges are set for maintenance. And if we look at the Papendrechtse Brug or the Papendrechtse Bridge, this bridge is due for maintenance, and we can also see that this bridge is vulnerable. So we'll zoom in to the Papendrechtse Brug, and that we will do on the next sheet. So last year we had extreme heat. The first time in the Netherlands, 40 degrees Celsius ever. We haven't seen that any time before. So what we saw is malfunctioning of the bridge, rerouting of traffic, but also stagnation of shipping. And we received a lot of critical media attention. But this last part is not part of the race to module from Deltares. So if we look at costs related to repair or related to traffic jams, we miss, for example, media attention in our risk assessment. So that's why we want to use Ramsheep. And we'll tell about that some more. Ramsheep is a tool that we use at Rijkswaterstaat for our asset management. And each of the letters in the word Ramsheep, that stands for example, reliability of an object, or availability, safety, but also economics and politics. So in our risk assessment, we try to look further beyond the costs. And that's what we tried with this bridge as well. So if you look at the next sheet, then we will see a very large table. And this table basically has all the parts of Ramsheep, but also the effects. So are the effects limited or are the effects severe? So that helps us scoring such a risk as heat. So if we click several times, you see that the availability was severely scored. It was very bad because the bridge wasn't operational as well. And if you look at the next, it has a major effect on repair. You can see that we can cool the bridge, but if we are too late with cooling the bridge, the damage will be structural and the entire bridge may face new bridge parts. If we look further, we also see the effects on, let's have a look. Oh my gosh, these are the costs, or the repair costs. I'm sorry, it's tiny letters, but also it had a real political impact. So we received national media attention. And if we lastly click, then you see that in the risk matrix, this scores undesirable. So this bridge goes into maintenance, and we have to do something with this issue of heat in this bridge, because the consequences are major. So this is what we'll be doing with a lot of parts of our network, and that's on the final sheet as well. And the final sheet explains our next steps. I'll keep that brief because Kees also mentioned it. We want to upscale this approach to each regional unit within the Rijkswaterstaat, but also have the external risk dialogue. It's not only an issue of Rijkswaterstaat, but of the entire environment. So together with local water boards, with local municipalities or provinces, we want to talk about these climate risks and see what measures can be taken. So that's in short our first efforts to also assess the risks and see which risks are should be managed and others that may be accepted. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kees and Mirta. And now I will turn it over to Gordana Petkovic with the Conference of European Directors of Roads.
There. Hello, everybody. My name is Gordana Petkovic. I work for the Norwegian Public Roads Administration, and I am sending my greetings from Montenegro, where I am on holidays. I started my holidays, but I'm happy to be a part of this webinar, and I will try to present you briefly the work that has been done on research and development projects and working groups regarding climate change in CEDAR. So the Conference of European Road Directors, or CEDAR, is a platform for cooperation and promotion of improvements to the road system and its infrastructure. It has 28 members. They represent their respective national road authorities, and they provide support, advice on decisions concerning the road transport system that are taken at a national or at an international level. And it's a pretty broad challenge because all of these countries have their ways of doing things. They have their languages, their needs, their possibilities. So it's quite a challenging but interesting work. Among the strategic objectives of CEDAR, it says that CEDAR wants to help national road administrations keep ahead of the curve, anticipate future trends, and prepare them to face new challenges. And that is what we need when it comes to resilience, ensuring resilience and climate change, handling climate change. So the common challenges for European countries are aging infrastructure. Also, budgets are under pressure, time schedules are under pressure, and whoever is working on optimizing budgets and time schedules might not know the impact of climate change and might not be willing to deal with the impacts of climate change and deal with uncertainties such as the uncertainty in, for example, projections of heavy precipitation. That seems to be a problem in many places. So there is a big need for knowledge of risks and costs and benefits and good documentation of what we need and what the effects of measures are. And the future will bring more challenges because we need to manage road networks in a changing climate, but also population growth and traffic growth and the growth in society's expectation regarding both mobility on one side and safety on the other, and of course environmental requirements, where the central issue is mitigating climate change, where the transportation has an important role. So CEDAR has invested both in research and in dedicated working groups in addressing mitigation and adaptation to climate change. So I will tell you something about that. Climate change was the subject of the very first call for cross-border funded joint research programs. That was the result of an ERANET program, EU-funded ERANET program. And the call was called modestly, Road Owners Getting to Grips with Climate Change. There were 4 interesting Ardennes projects that were invested in. They covered very different themes. I will tell you very briefly about each of them. One project dealt with a local winter index, where they combined climate scenarios and observation spatial data. Then we had a program on pavement, the effect of climate change on pavement, on moisture, water, transportation in pavements. The Rimorock project was a very good project that clarified how climate change can be handled through a risk management approach. So it systemized a lot of existing tools that were not really used in connection with climate change and provided a good basis for further work. And SWAMP, that was a very popular project, stormwater prevention, that among other things developed a method, a blue spot analysis method for identifying sections that were especially prone to flooding. The second call was done in 2012. Then we moved a bit towards a more practical angle. And the title of that call was Road Owners Adapting to Climate Change. So this call was, in this call, contributions were asked to provide road owners with technologies and models and tools to support decision-making concerning adaptation measures. Like, what do we do? What do we do first? How do we prioritize? So here we invested in 2 projects. One project dealt with climate projection data, developed a guideline for a transnational database of downscaled climate projection data for road networks that go through several countries. And RoadApt, the other project that was built on the Rimorock project and had a risk-based and practical approach. It developed a tool for a rather quick analysis of the risks along the road network and a database of adaptation measures with good examples of what can be done in which cases and why. So those were the 2 calls. And before I go to the third call, I would like to say that in the meantime, working groups were also organized. So in the working groups, the people working here are actually the staff of the road administrations. So the first 2 reports have been developed through simply sharing knowledge and experience and managing to put together good examples of how climate change is handled. So we have these 2 reports that give a good overview of issues that are important for road agencies concerning adaptation to climate change and also mitigation. Whereas the 3rd report is actually a template for developing a strategy for adaptation to climate change. So this is really very useful work and fun. I was lucky to be a part of one of that. The 3rd call and final call, it was recently finished, is called Climate Change from Desk to Road. This call had the aim to build on the outcomes of the first 2 calls. And we needed research that would help us integrate climate change, that would help us implement integrate, embed climate change into decision-making processes. So we recognized as very important to be able to implement is to focus on economic issues and to focus on different ways of including climate change into practice and into procurement. Here we invested in 3 projects. One is called Detector, Decision Support Tools for Embedding Climate Change Thinking on Roads. It addressed economic costs, the possibility of developing a business case for climate adaptation, and also issues around embedding climate change into practice and procurement. Then we had a program that addressed the requirement for a transnational approach to water management in the face of climate change. And we also had a smaller project on mobility management and driver behavior research. Just some short examples. You heard about the good work that was done in Netherlands. In Norway, we used a modified quick scan method that is a result of the RoadApp project to assess and prioritize risk along a section of the European 39 route. So using this method, we discovered which threats are the most important threats in which section. We chose adaptation measures and assess the costs and assess cost benefits, and in this way provided a good basis for making decisions on what to do first. A few words about the Irish work. In Ireland, they implemented several of the projects from CEDAR as a basis for a general approach to climate change adaptation. Among other things, development of a flood risk map for the entire national road network, and in addition, a development of a protocol for dealing with specific flood events. One of the challenges was how to present the results of the risk assessment. So this is just an illustration of how that was done. So implementation of this is, of course, very important. The first step of deployment is dissemination, and I would say if the reports were only disseminated and read, and if everybody who reads the reports thought about how they relate to their everyday work, I think a lot would already be done. Implementation is never direct implementation of a tool. It always has to be adapted, adjusted to national frameworks, national requirements. So these examples that I mentioned briefly all start with an adaptation to the national situation. CEDAR is following how the results of transnational research are being implemented, which is a very important and motivating thing. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gordana. Now we have Lizzie Kemp with the Colorado Department of Transportation. So Lizzie, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter now.
Okay, I just take off mute. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay. And are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Very interesting presentations. I think we seem to be following a similar methodology or framework as to what folks in Europe seem to be doing. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some culvert risk mitigation planning that the Colorado Department of Transportation has been working on. So I'm going to give first a little bit of background on the CDOT resiliency program, talk a bit about tools that we've developed for quantifying vulnerability and risk, because we have spent a good part of the last couple of years developing these tools, and we're then finally I'm going to transition into how then we can use the results and the data that comes from using those tools in decision making. We are just kind of on the cusp now of starting to see how we can use the data that we're able to create from the tools to informing our decisions. And in particular, I'm going to give an example of that in culvert planning. So the CDOT resiliency program, I always like to start back on talking about how CDOT became deliberately interested in resiliency. And we saw in 2013, we had major floods in Colorado, and it was interesting to see that many of the facilities that were damaged or destroyed in the 2013 fire or 2013 flood were the same facilities that were destroyed in another major flood in 1976. So when you start to see that the very same facilities, when we build them back the same way, are getting destroyed time and time again, there may be something different that we can do. What can we do now to avoid some of these things in the future? So most everybody on the call, I imagine, is aware of what the AASHTO definition of resiliency is, but I think it's good to remind ourselves. The AASHTO definition is the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, or more successfully adapt to adverse events. The CDOT Resiliency Program was created formally in 2018 with a policy directive. I like to mention this just to show that it's been important to this program that we've had executive management support for moving this initiative forward, and it's been really a strong basis for pushing resiliency into day-to-day CDOT activities at CDOT. So what are some of the tools that CDOT has developed? One of the first tools that we developed was this asset criticality measure with the idea, and it's similar, I think, to what the Netherlands seems to have done. The idea is that some roads are more critical than others from a resiliency perspective. And we created a GIS model that looks at a number of variables that essentially help us to identify which roadways, if they were taken out by some sort of a hazard, would most critically impair the operation of our system. And in doing that, we focused on what is called the triple bottom line approach. So looking at what are the social factors, the environmental factors, and the economic factors. So in this case, we looked at, how heavily used is the road, what is the average daily traffic, what's the economic impact, what's the value of freight that's shipped on those roads, what's the value of tourism that's within a certain proximity to those roadways. Social impact, we used a measure called SOVI, which is a national measure that's done at the county level, actually at the census tract level, that looks at a number of different socioeconomic characteristics that are good predictors of how quickly a community can get back to normal operations after some sort of a hazard event. And then system impact was the system redundancy. Very similar to the Netherlands, where we have identified an alternate route that works, then it's probably not as critical that we mitigate the risk on those roadways. So that criticality map or model resulted in this map. And you'll see that when you combine those 6 variables, we ended up identifying about 21% of the CDOT roadway system that we deemed to be critical for system resilience. So those roadways that are shown in red are the ones that are deemed to be most critical. From there, we developed a risk and resiliency standard manual. It's going to be published this summer, very soon. And what it does is it's basically a cookbook that anyone can pick up, anyone within our department or anywhere in Colorado. It's adaptable, I think, to other states too, but you need to look at the assumptions. But it basically takes you through step by step on how to run a risk and resiliency analysis. What it does is it standardizes the data, the assumptions, and the method for conducting that risk assessment. The standard is based on what's called the RAMCAP model, which stands for Risk Assessment and Management for Critical Asset Protection. That's a standard, it's a risk assessment method that was developed back in the early 2000s. And it basically lays out a process, a logical process for assessing risk. Looks at what are the assets of concern and their condition, basically their characteristics, where they're located, value, condition. What are the physical threats that are likely to happen in any given location? The impact of those threats on the assets, and then finally, what are the optimal investments to make now in advance of future events? So it involves a benefit cost assessment at the end that can show you where your dollars make most sense from a financing standpoint. From that template, or from that standard, we created Excel templates. And I know this is very small and hard to read, but I'll try to mouse over. I think you all can see my mouse. You'll see that in this workbook, this Excel workbook, we have a tab for each threat asset pair. So for rockfall on roadways, for flooding on roadways, and in this case, I've highlighted the flood and minor culvert Excel template. But basically I wanted to highlight there's a place here where you enter data about the asset, and then another place within the spreadsheet that gives you the output of the risk data. So it gives you in a dollar cost, in an annualized dollar cost way, what is the risk to CDOT as an owner of a particular threat at an asset, and what is the risk to the users, that is the folks who are using our roadways and who would be delayed or impacted some other way negatively, and what's the value of that? What's the cost of that on an annualized basis? The rest of what's in this spreadsheet is basically automatic calculations and data that go into calculating that risk based on the data that's entered. So I know this looks very complicated and cumbersome, but in fact, a lot of this information that's in the rest of the spreadsheet it's basically hard-coded based on the assumptions that are within the standard. So again, as I mentioned, what this standard gives you is an annualized risk. So the dollar cost for a particular threat at a particular asset, given the worst reasonable event, what is the owner cost, which is the cost to CDOT to have to replace that asset if it's destroyed, and what is the user cost, largely related to the value of time for a detour or delay if the roadway is taken out. So now getting to the part about culverts and how do we use these tools to make decisions in prioritizing what risks mitigate, and this is where we're relatively new to this. It took us a long time to develop tools and data, and now the exciting part is to say, so what do we do with that data? One of the things that we did was we did a risk assessment of an entire corridor. So we looked at Interstate 70, which is the major east-west interstate across Colorado, from state line to state line, from Utah to Kansas, and looked at all of our assets and a wide range of threats. And again, using that RAMCAP process, the goal of this is to look at what are the optimal investments to make now in advance of future threats happening to reduce our risk and improve system resilience. The results from that pilot, this just gives you an example of the type of data that you can get out of this standardized risk assessment process, but it shows here, first chart on the left, top left, shows that our owner risk on an annualized basis is about $6 million. That's our exposure as an owner to the probability of a threat. And I'll just mention in passing that most of that risk on Interstate 70 is related to rockfall within the mountain corridors. We have an issue with rocks falling on the road and damaging the roads and bridges. A much larger risk was identified on I-70, about $165 million per year related to user risk. So that's the risk of delay and detours that are caused to the users of our system. When you break this blue bar down into a pie chart to say, what's making up, what are the causes of that risk, you'll see that about 75% or 3/4 of that risk to users related to flood. And then if you further take that, 3/4 pie piece and break it down to say which assets are most at risk in causing that detour and delay, you'll see that the large majority of that is related to flooding at minor culverts. So that led us to a data-driven decision, right, to say that one of the things that we should look at from a risk mitigation perspective is minor culverts and flooding. And we made the decision that that's likely a trend or a statistic that translates to the rest of our system. It's in all likelihood not just related to I-70, but in fact can be projected to be a risk throughout CDOT's system. So that led us to that decision and to lead to some culvert mitigation planning. So again, coming back to this idea, what can we do now to avoid this in the future? And acknowledging that culvert failure can come in many different ways, and that it really depends on understanding what's going on at those culverts. We looked at trying to prioritize risk at culverts, and within the state of Colorado, we have about 60,000 small culverts, which we quickly recognized we didn't have the capacity to do an assessment on 60,000, and we needed to whittle that down. So we used some GIS tools and this criticality map that I mentioned earlier to identify a subset of those 60,000 culverts that we wanted to focus on first. And what we identified is that if we looked at just those culverts that are in poor condition and that are on highly critical routes, we could reduce that list to about 1,000 culverts statewide. So we decided to focus on those 1,000 culverts, and we've identified a process that we're about to kick off in August with a group of subject matter experts around the state. We'll be going out and inspecting those high-risk culverts, the 1,000 culverts that we identified, getting pictures of them, getting a good assessment in a standardized way of really what's going on with those culverts and what it is that's about them that gives them a poor condition. Second step is then to bring that data back into the office and work with our engineers and hydraulics folks and maintenance folks to identify a specific mitigation action for each of those culverts. And those mitigation actions could be a capital improvement like replacing the culvert or slip lining the culvert or some other investment. Or it could be operational. It could be just asking our maintenance folks or designing a plan for our maintenance folks to go out and clean out those culverts more frequently than they normally would. Or we could install some technology to monitor flows and stuff in order to be able to predict and clear out a culvert when there's a problem before it becomes a big problem. And then the third step is to use that standard that I showed you earlier to run a risk calculation for two conditions. So you'd first calculate the risk at the base condition. So as is, what is the dollar cost risk to that culvert? And then rerun that risk after it's mitigated. So you change some of the condition data that goes in to the inputs of the model to determine what the amount of risk is that you can buy down by investing in that mitigation action. And then finally, from those, you could calculate the benefit cost. The result of all of this, hopefully, is a solid data-based, data-driven recommendation for a list of culvert improvements that make sense to CDOT in a benefit cost way. So looking at making those optimal investments right now to reduce risk where it makes the most sense to us, rather than just accepting that risk and addressing the problem when it happens. So that's just one example of what CDOT is doing in terms of trying to use the data and tools that we've developed to try to help make some good, solid, data-driven decisions about reducing risk. Thank you very much. My contact information is there.
Thanks, Lizzie. And now we're going to hear from Judy Gates, who's with HNTB, formerly with Maine DOT. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter, Judy.
I am having technical difficulties.
I think if you go ahead and open PowerPoint. There you go.
Okay. No. I don't know how you're seeing my screen.
I'm not not in presentation mode.
All right. See, the things that work in practice that just don't. Okay. Well,
It won't
I'm
start.
trying. It won't start.
Okay. Oh wait, there we go. So, yep.
How's
Oh,
that?
there you go.
Ah, magic. See, it always happens when you think you've got it. Good morning, barely, here in the Northeast. Judy Gates. I'm currently an environmental planning manager with HNTB. I spent about 10 years with Maine DOT, where we started working on climate resilience for statewide assets. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So as you've heard from the other presentations, Maine DOT is not alone in wondering how to translate increasing frequency of extreme weather events and the projections for climate change. Mostly we started with sea level rise into what consequences that has on schedules and budgets. So how will we know when to act? So in looking to answer this holy grail of a question, we want first identify the factors that were key to influencing delivery, things like 11th hour changes in design, and having to go out and gather data. New data was always very expensive. Having old data ended up being very expensive. Not being able to make a decision early in the work plan process. So decisions would be made about replacing a structure kind of based on history rather than on forward thinking. And that was, that's the way we operate. There's also a focus with all of us on keeping our costs down and having predictability in when work can be delivered. So what Maine DOT did, with a lot of help by Federal Highway and TRB and other entities that gave us money to do so, we developed the Transportation Risk Assessment for project planning and delivery, or TRAPT, as we affectionately refer to it. The development of TRAPT started about in 2015 or so, and was focused primarily on bridges and large culverts 10 feet and above in diameter, and only state infrastructure. So we first started thinking about what data would be useful to this process. Like, we needed to know what the condition of the asset is. We needed to know how many people used it. We needed to know the types of habitat that were there. And we needed to know about other landscape features, such as historic properties, other things that could significantly delay a project. So there was a conscious decision here to look beyond just climate and weather influences, but also look at other things that could pose threats to a budget or a delivery schedule. So we took these metrics that were made for decision making, and we transformed them very much as Colorado did, and actually Norway and the Netherlands as well, into a ranking system. So the red box is around sea level rise. So this would be a score that was set based on a GIS layer and the location of a project, and would give an indication of how susceptible an asset was or is to predicted threat. So this weighting was assigned of each of these questions was assigned based on its potential effect on schedule and budget. So For instance, the presence of an endangered species could be a showstopper in terms of design. You would have to spend, instead of $150,000 replacing a culvert, it might end up being $500,000 by the time you provided for Atlantic salmon passage. So those were definitely weighted into this matrix. We then use these ratings to determine which of the assets were most at risk. And we also use the red, yellow, green, I guess we like that, in the transportation forums to indicate the level of risk posed at a feature by hydrology, landscape features, or ecology of the area. So one of the things that became important with this is being able to know where to really put your dollars. And if you looked at everything that just came up in Trapped as having a score, you could really make some decisions about delaying a project where the risk was really manageable. So for instance, you can filter with Trapped, you can filter out all of the projects where the vulnerability rating for sea level rise and storm surge is equal to 0. So that took, in those coastal towns, that took the number of threatened assets, from almost 6,000 to under 200. And as Colorado found, that's a much more reasonable bite at the apple to be able to go out and look at a couple hundred structures versus 6,000 structures. So at the same time that we were developing Trapped at DOT, there were a lot of other efforts going on. In the yellow, you see U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was doing stream barrier mapping. Maine Audubon had developed a Stream Smart design program. The Nature Conservancy was looking at a coastal risk explorer at this time. And we also had existing data in the orange, the Maine DOT Large Culvert Program. Those were just a few of them. There was also a successful effort by some conservation partners to develop a bond-funded program for municipal culvert replacement, knowing that the towns in a largely rural state often don't have the funds to replace culverts to be resilient. Just don't have the funding for that, and to provide the technical assistance. So we knew that Trapped could work very well with all of these different efforts. So how do we put that together? And that's where the work, when I moved to HNTB, that's what we've been working on. So we took this Trapped data, and there were about 6,000 records in Trapped. Those records were primarily coastal, but also included just larger structures in non-coastal towns. And then, so that gave us about 200 vulnerable structures. There was also the Maine DOT culvert data, and that looked at culverts between 12 inches and 5 feet. The determination was anything smaller than that was probably a drainage culvert. So that gave us an additional 35,000 culverts. And then the Nature Conservancy's inland stream barriers and subsequent evaluation of the passage barriers gave us another 25,000. So that's quite a bit more data than just the 6,000 record numbers that Trapped alone would return. And it's important to take all these tools and put them together because they all really look at different things, right? They had different features that they could incorporate. And if we could put these all into one platform, not only would that be useful to state transportation asset managers, but also to those municipal managers. So what we've been doing is developing this Maine Municipal Infrastructure Planning Toolbox. And what this will do is put all of those together. So, what looks like a conglomeration, kind of a scatter plot of orange and yellow and blue is actually all of the culverts from those overlapped systems. So you end up with, this also shows the blue and the yellow. It's just that orange ends up on top because it's numerous. So these are all of the stream crossings. You might wonder what this big blank space is if you're not familiar with Maine, and that's primarily private forest lands. And so we do not have culvert data on those lands. So you can zoom in on this and look at one town in particular, the town of Mechanic Falls in the middle of Maine. And you can see that really the number of assets that fall under the responsibility of any one town is relatively small. It's large in proportion to their budget of maintaining and replacing their infrastructure, but small compared to the number in the state. So it is, you can look at these and say, okay, which of these are state-owned? And those would be the ones that are orange or blue. And which of these are in the responsibility of the town? And those are probably the yellow. So you can zoom in even further on one, stretch of road in particular and see that, well, the town really doesn't own any assets in this area. Probably all of the structures that might be subject to flooding are DOTs. So if I'm a town asset manager, this is a relief to me. If I'm DOT, it's maybe not so much of a relief, but it gives us a sense of where we might experience problems, as well as if, for example, a culvert up here, this orange dot is upsized to accommodate fish passage on this little stream, then what problems are going to happen downstream? Probably not too many, given this undeveloped stretch. But if you're in a developed part of the state, you might have to worry about that. So Tract and this municipal platform, which is a story map platform, is more than just points on a map, right? It will connect to the information on why stream smart crossings are important, how you develop a stream smart crossing, whether there's data for your town. With the coastal towns, it will link you to the Nature Conservancy's Coastal Risk Explorer. It will also connect to financial opportunities for assistance for municipalities or private landowners. It will also link you to technical assistance, which is a big gap. There are only a small number of stream restoration practitioners in Maine, and they can get spread pretty thin, and then frequently asked questions. So the value of this is that we take this data that has been developed and is available, and we disseminate it without changing it. So we are not affecting the data that's in the TNC, but we're giving people the opportunity to see that data and hopefully get a better sense of where the risks are. So we've met our objective, that you can understand the probability of something happening and reduce the consequence. And that speaks to the definition of risk, which is probability times consequence, thereby minimizing your risk and maximizing your resiliency. One of the things that I do want to be clear about is that this is not a prioritization tool. The prioritization still happens based on level of service, safety, and the condition of the asset. But when the condition of the asset, when all those things rise to a work plan and a project being included, there's a much better understanding of the level of design and time that needs to go into that project to create the resiliency. And as that, it's easier to balance the resource allocation, of dollars over a work plan without any surprises. So I thank you very much and stay tuned. This story map is scheduled to be live probably September or October. We're working with all of the partners that are contributing data, and we're very excited to put it out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. So we've only received one question so far, which I can answer. Yes, we will have a recording of the slides, of the webinar and the slides on the AASHTO Center for Environmental Excellence website in the coming weeks, and that address is environment.transportation.org. Again, it will happen hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And then I would also just mention again that if you do have any questions, you can just type them into the chat box there on your control panel, and we will do our best to answer them. So Tina, if you are ready to go, I will make you presenter.
How does that look?
Perfect, and we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be giving an overview of the resilience resources that the Federal Highway Administration has available. And I should give credit to my team members. I'm a member of our sustainability and resilience team, and we have several staff. So I'm going to be talking about the work that some of the others on my team have been doing as well. So this is a quick overview slide. We've been working on the topic of resilience for probably about 15 years. One of the very first efforts was the Gulf Coast study, the first phase of which did a broad vulnerability assessment for the entire Gulf Coast region. And then the second phase used the Mobile, Alabama area as a case study and developed tools that are applicable nationwide. And since that time, many transportation agencies have been using those tools. We have also funded a number of resilience pilots with state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations across the country. And these pilot projects have done analyses looking at their vulnerabilities and what adaptation options they might have. We did a focus study on the Hurricane Sandy affected region of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut to see what could be learned from that storm in order to improve resilience in that area. We have a vulnerability assessment and adaptation framework, which steps transportation agencies through how to analyze their vulnerabilities and then integrate that information into decision-making processes in order to improve resilience. That links to a number of our other resources and research that we've conducted. We've updated our engineering guidance. Hydraulic engineering circulars 25 and 17, those are the ones for the coastal environment and the river environment. Those have been updated with information on resilience and changing conditions. We also have a report called Synthesis of Approaches for Addressing Resilience in Project Development, which looked at a number of particular assets, culverts, bridges, pavements, etc., and analyzed different adaptation solutions, and then also drew from that and from other sources lessons learned for project level decision making. Our operations office had developed a resilience and operations and maintenance guide. So one of our more recent items, and I'll focus on it because I was the lead for this project, is an implementation guide on nature-based solutions, which provides information to transportation agencies on how they can use nature-based solutions such as wetlands restoration, dune restoration, building artificial reefs or oyster reefs in order to reduce erosion and flooding of their coastal highways. So the implementation guide has technical fact sheets on each of several different nature-based solutions. It has information on the benefits of these, for instance, information from the research literature on the percent reduction in wave heights that a certain width of marsh can provide. That also has information on co-benefits such as benefits to recreation, habitat, fisheries, water quality, etc. And then it also has information on typical costs of these type of solutions in comparison with traditional solutions and a lot of examples. The guide generally follows the process of project planning and delivery. So it goes through planning, site assessment, design, permitting, construction, and then monitoring, maintenance, and adaptive management. So I'd encourage you to take a look. Current project that we're working on is developing a handbook on resilience and asset management. And the impetus for this project was that transportation legislation requires state departments of transportation to develop asset management plans for identifying and addressing risks to national highway system pavements, bridges, and performance. And that includes climate resilience risks and risks of facilities that have been repeatedly damaged. So FHWA sponsored 6 resilience and asset management pilots. Those are the states listed there. And those pilot reports are posted at the link below. And later this year, we should be issuing a handbook on incorporating resilience in transportation asset management plans and the asset management planning process. And that'll include information on developing asset inventories informed by natural hazard assessments, information on identifying and managing risks, conducting life cycle planning, and creating resilient investment strategies and financial plans. We also have a project on integrating resilience into transportation planning, and the impetus for this was transportation legislation that passed that requires resilience as a planning factor in state and metropolitan transportation plans. And for our European partners, in the United States, the federal government requires states and metropolitan areas to develop transportation plans in order to receive federal funding for transportation projects. So for this project, we held a series of workshops. We also developed a white paper that's available online, and then later this year, we'll be issuing a handbook. And here's a sneak peek at some of the information in there. You can see the planning process laid out in a circular form here, and then the different insertion points where resilience can be considered. Now, the last project that I'll mention that we have available are these rapid resilience assessments. So with this, we have a small team of FHWA, state DOT, and contractor subject matter experts who are available to come out and look at affected locations 6 to 8 weeks after an event and report on their observations. And the reason for the 6 to 8 weeks timing is because immediately after an event, the transportation department is usually focused on clearing debris and getting roads open to the extent possible for essential traffic. And then at that later point, the 6 to 8 weeks point, they might have the bandwidth to start looking at what can they do to reduce risks for the future. So we've done this in Oklahoma and are intending to after major flooding events there, and we're intending to have this available for other areas for future events. So that was the last project I wanted to mention, so I can turn it back over to Melissa.
Thanks, Tina. So we did have a question come in, and it's from Mirta. So you had mentioned that the recent heat in the Netherlands had impacts on bridges. Were you able to draw any conclusions about the bridges that were most vulnerable to the heat events? Bridge type, design, certain components, age, any of those factors?
Yeah, good question. So what we already see in the bridges nowadays, they are all designed in the 60s. So these bridges have been designed to climate standards from the 60s, to also availability of less traffic, less weight also in transportation, for example, in trucks. So there's a lot more going on than only climate risks. However, the conversations about bridges, they will start within a few weeks. So unfortunately, I do not have the most recent discussion with our asset management on these risks on bridges. Maybe Kees can also add something from a different validation of our building department. But for now, that's also what we are very interested in to figure out the coming weeks. So hopefully next time we can tell you a bit more on that as well.
Great, thank you. So I am quickly going to talk a little bit about AASHTO and where resilience resides within AASHTO, and also some of the activities that we have underway through the Center for Environmental Excellence. So I pulled this slide up just to show you that a few years ago in 2016, AASHTO restructured its committee organization. And as you can see, resilience was included in the Transportation System Security and Resilience Committee, which is there in the middle of your screen, which is classified as an enterprise or cross-discipline committee. And I raised that because it is the mission of that committee to work closely with our program delivery and operations committees, which are there in that orange box on the left side. And it was a new committee created in the restructuring. So Lizzie already showed this AASHTO adopted definition. And so there it is again. But I also wanted to show this. So this graphic, the first chair of the TSSR committee was Mike Lewis, the former executive director for the Colorado Department of Transportation. And one of the things that was important to him was that we be able to convey how we would look at resilience at AASHTO, which you can see here. His vision was that resilience would be kind of included in what he called the life cycle of state DOT, and everything from planning, designing, building, operating, and maintaining. And then in the middle there, you can see the rescue, recover, and rebuild around an event of some sort. So this was put together to graphically convey what the committee sees as their kind of ultimate goal with regard to resilience. I did mention that through the Center for Environmental Excellence, we do have some ongoing activities, but I wanted to give a historical perspective as well. Beginning in 2017, we did a resilience peer exchange for state DOTs. We had about 36 state DOTs participate, which helped kind of springboard into the RISE conference that we worked with TRB to convene in October of 2018 in Denver, and I'm sure many of you were able to attend that conference. And then lastly, in November of last year, the Transportation Resilience 2019 conference that, again, we worked with Federal Highway and TRB to organize and hold in Washington, D.C. in November. So here are just some very high-level snapshots of what happened in the 2017 peer exchange. Again, we had 36 states, Federal Highway, TRB. We did do a lot of facilitated breakouts with the folks that attended, and we also had a cartoonist attend the conference as well and draw while we were speaking. So this graphic came from that peer exchange, which kind of looks similar to the life cycle graphic that I had up just a second ago. But one of the things that came up continually, and I think Lizzie, you mentioned it in your presentation, was this idea that there would be a cookbook where you would bake resilience into everything that the state DOT does, and that there would be an institutionalization of resilience in everything that a state DOT does. So at TR 2019 in November, we did work and participate on the conference planning committee. We worked with each state DOT CEO to identify participants. We held a committee on transportation system security and resilience meeting during the conference. And our chair, our current chair, who's Ed Sniffen with the Hawaii Department of Transportation, also participated on one of the keynote state DOT leadership panels. We also participated in a closing session. I think this is probably the most important part, to help identify future activities that AASHTO can work on through the Center for Environmental Excellence. So here are some of the examples of what we'll be working on in our next center work plan. And let me quickly say that the center is a partnership that we have with the Federal Highway Administration. So we definitely will be working closely with Tina and her colleagues to put together these kinds of materials, including building out a website portal for kind of best practices, resources, and that kind of thing. We will be doing resilience webinar series. And then we hope at some point, once we get through this pandemic situation, that there will be an opportunity to hold additional in-person peer exchanges. The other service that we provide at AASHTO is the Resilient Sustainable Transportation Systems Technical Services Program. It is an AASHTO pooled fund. We do a climate briefing newsletter 10 times a year, and we have organized a webinar series in the past, and we did one in April of this year, focused largely on state DOT COVID-19 response and recovery. And there's my contact information, and again, the presentations will be posted on the center's website and a recording. We have another question that came in for Gordana, if you're still on. You mentioned the value of dissemination. Do you have suggestions on how we can get this info into the hands of those who need it most? And I'll unmute your line, Gordana. There you go.
Well, that's a very important thing to be able to answer to, but well, what can I say? All of the reports are published and published on the internet, and I guess the dissemination in the CEDAR system is supposed to be done by the National Road Agency. So like everybody's is responsible for their own agency, their own administration, to make that knowledge known. But of course, it's never enough, so I'm not really sure what to say. Well, conferences, I think all of this, like this webinar, is just great. It's just all situations in which you can hear about what else exists, and what you can look up afterwards is just the perfect thing you can do.
Melissa, may I add to that? This is Lizzie.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so just a couple of thoughts, and I might need your help reminding me what the name of the report is, but I'm not sure if it was TRB or AASHTO within the US that published a document about a year ago, I think it was, that is a primer of the importance of resilience in transportation investments for executives. So at a very high level, talks about the importance of resilience and how CEOs can incorporate resilience into different aspects of a Department of Transportation operation. Do you remember what that was called?
Yes, so that is a product that's coming out of a National Cooperative Highway Research Program, NCHRP. And I believe that it is nearly complete and ready to be published, but yes, they have a primer, as you mentioned, that is geared towards the executive level within state DOTs. And one of the items that had been identified during the review process of that document is that, you know, in the United States, there are some state DOT CEOs that are politically appointed. And so in order to institutionalize this idea, you know, the suggestion was made that that book also be targeted not just to the CEOs, but also perhaps the chief engineers as an example, but to really distribute that widely through the executive leadership within state DOTs so that, you know, that those ideas could be institutionalized. But yes, it is an NCHRP document, and I believe it's set to be published or finalized soon.
Okay, so maybe just two other thoughts if I can. So I think that's an important thing, is to get this on the radar of your executive folks. In Colorado, something that we've done that I found to be really helpful is that we have set up a structure. We have a resiliency working group that has key representatives from around the state in different disciplines. So we have some engineers on that. We have some environmental staff, planning staff, hydraulics folks, policy folks that meet once a month and talk about what's going on in resilience and make some recommendations. And then we also have an executive oversight committee, which consists of various members of our executive management that meets every other month, and we give them higher level briefings on a regular basis about, what we're doing in the way of resiliency and to get their support. One of the things that came out of that again, I think is important is that our executive oversight committee wanted us to create a policy directive for our commission to sign that gives us basically the policy backing to continue this work, and that we can show that this is an important thing for the agency and that our executives want us to address.
Yeah, those are great points, Lizzie. And I'll stop there and see if Case or Merta or Judy, Gordana, if any of you have any other thoughts to offer on that question.
Well, I
so
think,
this is Judy.
Go ahead, Judy.
Okay. The idea with the story map that we're producing is that it is available out there for people to at least get an idea of what else is going on in the state, what the standards are that DOT is using to reconstruct, how resilience and risk are viewed and looked at, and so they can make, informed decisions. And I think the story maps are a very accessible tool to people that are maybe outside transportation industry. And that was our thinking with DOT of, how to approach disseminating that information. It's just one way.
Thanks, Judy. Case?
Yeah, thank you. I think, so the question was, how can you disseminate? And I think actually this webinar is a great example how to disseminate, to just spread it in use. And it always is hard work to get people involved. We in Holland say never waste a good crisis. Maybe you say the same. So I thought about some examples of flooding and also problems due to heat, which really helps within the country to actually make known the necessity for measures. And I think the websites, I think, for example, Federal Highways has an excellent website, and also, AASHTO has materials, CEDAR has materials, and it's just keep on repeating the message that this information is available, and within our organization, we'll also try to, not only within our own network, but everybody we know has something to do with our assets and working on resilience. We always tell what materials are available if there are webinars, but generally it's hard work, but always giving lots of information. And I think this webinar is also an excellent example that there are excellent examples available from other countries, and so that can really, and I think that's something good to know, that make use of the examples and materials that are available from others, instead of thinking of your own methods or working out your own methods. Yeah, that's what I like to say. And about in our presentation, which will be also sent, there's also a reference to two presentations from Del Tarish at the TR 2019 conference. So there, if you want to dig in just a bit more into the methods in Holland, and also our Dutch stress test will be translated into English, which is actually sponsored by Federal Highways, and it's supposed to be available by September.
Great. Okay, so I'll stay in close contact with you, because I'm sure that that's something that we'll want to be able to make available on our website if possible. So I will stay in touch with you. All right, well, we have no other questions, so I will just for a second want to thank all of our panelists today, and remind everyone again that this webinar recording and the slides will be available on the center's website, environment.transportation.org, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And with that, I would thank you all for your time and wish you a very nice rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
That's great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.